In this lesson, we're going to take a look at time lapses. They're a great addition to a video story, perfect for transitioning from one scene to another, and you can really get really creative with them. But there's a few tips that I'd like to go over with you. The first one is don't make your time-lapse videos too long. No one really wants to watch a 40-second or 1-minute time-lapse of your video, so try to keep them around 10 seconds or so, and then they'll be much more effective. The next tip is lock your exposure and white balance when shooting in case the lighting conditions change. The only exception to this is when you're capturing a sunrise or sunset, and we'll get into that in the examples coming up. Also, another thing to remember is when recording a time-lapse, the audio is not recorded, so time-lapses are silent. So if you want to add some background sounds or effects later on, you have to do this in post, so it'll be a good time to use your phone or recorder and just get some ambient noise of what you're shooting. But what is a time-lapse anyway? Well, a time-lapse is simply capturing a single frame over a specific period of time, like 1 frame per second, for example. And when the captured video is played back, it appears speeded up. So let's take a look at how to do this in the app. You'll need to have your camera on a tripod or rest it on something similar to find a way of keeping it steady. It's also good on a bright sunny day to have an ND filter on. This way it'll lower the shutter speed and allow you for more natural motion blur. First we need to set up our exposure like we would for any other recording. So let's go into the settings, then record. For the codec, I'm going to choose H.265. Resolution is 4K. For the color space, I'm going to choose Rec 709. Let's take a look at how that looks. Let's go back to the settings under record and turn on the time-lapse recording. Now we have options for our capture frame rate. You have options from 2 frames to 10 minutes. And the clouds aren't moving fast today, so I'm going to choose 6 seconds as my interval. Now back in the main screen, we see the record button now looks like a timer record. Next, we want to lock our white balance, as I don't want the colors to change if the weather changes during the capture. So back in settings under camera, let's enable lock white balance on record. So this is looking good. Now let's set up the scene here and maybe have this big palm tree on the left side. To help us with that, let's turn on the grid lines. Tap this top icon and then choose grid lines. And now we can align the palm tree to the left line here. Then I can turn the grid lines back off. Now I want natural motion blur to my cloud movement. And as we know, that means that my shutter should be twice my frame rate, or 180 degrees. So I can set my shutter to 180 degrees. But as we expect, we're totally blown out because it's a bright sunny day. But let's lock the shutter at 180 degrees anyway. So to get the correct exposure, I need to put an ND filter on. This is a variable ND of 1 to 5 stops. So I simply rotate it until the image looks good, and I can view the histogram to make sure we're not clipping. One thing I've noticed is that if I use my ultra-wide 13mm camera, I'm getting some dark vignetting at the top of the left of the screen. So I'm going to switch back to the wide 24mm lens, and now that vignetting is gone. The next thing we want to do is lock exposure. So let's press on the screen, normally on the brightest area of the screen, which is usually the sky, and this will lock our exposure. And now we're ready to start recording. We can see that 2x, it looks more like a normal video, just speed it up a little bit. But which one should you choose? If you have fast moving subjects like traffic, or some people moving around at a train station, for example, or fast moving clouds, you can use a slower number or a lower number, like 2 to 10x. But if you have slower moving clouds, or a sunrise for example, then use a larger value like 20 to 30x. Now this is really trial and error. You need to test it out for yourself and see what values give you the time-lapse look that you want, and practice this before you need it. For example, don't wait to film the sunrise on the last day of your holiday or vacation, because if you mess up it's too late and you won't get another chance until the next day. So let's take a look at the different speeds here and see the difference. Now when I was about to film this, looking at the real clouds, they didn't seem to be moving at all. So I know that they're very, very slow. This is the first one, and it's set to 2x. Here we see the clouds still don't look like they're moving very much. Again, our subject in this case are the clouds, and they're moving too slow for this speed. Next we set the capture to 15x, which takes 2 minutes and 30 seconds for a 10-second time-lapse video. Here we see that we now get some nice movement in the clouds. Next we set our capture rate to 30x. Here we have the most movement in the clouds, as in this method it captures the frames less frequently over a longer time. So we see more movement even though the clouds aren't moving very much to the human eye in real life. Let's take a look if we have fast moving subjects like cars. Here we see the cars captured at 2x speed. Here we see cars captured at 5x speed. Here we see cars captured at 15x speed. Here we see cars captured at 30x speed. The cars in this capture rate are just a blur. So looking at the footage, I think somewhere around 12x would be ideal. Another great example is to place your phone down somewhere and just stand in front of some moving traffic. You try to keep still, and this gives the illusion of all the cars whizzing around you while you're stuck in space with no movement. Now you only need a few minutes at a speed of about 4 to 10x, as the cars are already moving fast. But what about sunrise and sunsets? For this you don't want to lock your exposure and white balance. If it's a sunrise, you'll probably start in the dark, so if you lock your white balance, when the sun rises, you'll get a bright blob in the scene. So we want to capture all that light and changing colors as the sun rises or sets. And make sure the white balance is set to auto, and set your recording to 30x. Now depending on where you are in the world and what time of the year, the sunrise and sunset can be very quick or take a long time. So check with the locals, or simply use your phone to see the times of the sunset and sunrises for wherever you are in the world. Again, practice this well before your final vacation day. In this video, I was trying to capture a sunrise, so I had to leave the camera on recording for about 30 minutes, and by the time the sun came up from it being dark, it was about 1.5 minutes in the final time-lapse video, which is too long. So I simply had to speed it up in post. Now what about blur on and off? Let's look at some videos with motion blur off and on. Remember, the higher your shutter speed, the less motion blur you'll get in the scene. In this first time lapse, we had a high shutter speed, and this is a result. Let's do the same again, but this time let's make sure that the shutter is 180 degrees, or twice my frame rate value, which should give us better motion blur in the movement. Again, you may need to use an ND filter depending on the lighting. And here's the result. And we see that the people have a more motion blur with their movement. Personally, I like this look better, but you have both options to choose from, and do whatever looks good for you. This next video is setting to a capture of 7x while I stand on a walk-in travelator or sidewalk, and here's the result. Time-lapse videos can be a great effect to use in your videos. Just remember not to have them too long, but like around 10 seconds or so, because your audience will get bored if it's any longer than this. So enjoy and be creative with them. Okay, let's move on to the next lesson.